President Zelenskyy has made his victory plan official in a point-by-point speech to the Ukrainian parliament and, by extension, the Ukrainian people. Is this victory plan really feasible? Is it actually something that the allies can get behind? And more importantly, what is in those secret annexes? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Now, before you get too confused, yeah, this victory plan actually does have secret annexes that are given to allies. Now, I'm not going to give you the full speech, but I did read it for context. And one of the things that is so common in these type of speeches is that the politicians themselves, their words are chosen very, very carefully. And oftentimes reporters will sort of have a slapdash method of translating them and making them more succinct. But in the process, they may lose keywords and phrasings. And so I wanted to make sure I read this from start to finish in all of its context, admittedly in English, but this is the official English translation on a Ukrainian government website, the Office of the President, literally a .gov domain name. So let's talk about these points. We're going to go point by point, and because I think they are really significant, and they're meant to be read from 1 to 5. And the first point, the overall thing to take away from this is what it doesn't have, right? It doesn't necessarily say that Ukraine is totally unwilling to give up territory. And it doesn't even say that Ukraine is unwilling to freeze the lines of combat where they are now. Even though he reportedly says these, he says Russia must not lose this war against Ukraine. Russia must lose the war against Ukraine. This is not a freeze, and this is not Ukraine trading territory or sovereignty. And I think this is interesting that I think there's a distinction here, a meaningful political distinction. A plan can include elements that are not like central to the plan, right? For example, if I was to go on a combat patrol, I would include the possibility that we are going to change a tire, need new batteries. But the mission is not a battery changing mission. It is not a tire changing mission. Those are contingencies that might be incidental but essential to completing the mission, but they are not the mission. And I think this is important because in his actual plan, neither of these things are precluded inherently. And that's not insignificant because this is a sign, I think, a very oblique one, that Russia and Ukraine are slowly, ever so gradually, creeping closer together in what they are willing to accept as an end state to the conflict, right? There's a Venn diagram, and there's starting to look more and more like closer to overlap. And we'll talk about where I think the overlap is most likely to land as we go through this. Okay, the first point is an invitation to NATO right now, right? Now, this is important because the invitation to NATO is something that has been sort of danced around for a long time, right? And Zelenskyy explicitly says that the invitation to NATO will be, for all intents and purposes, taken as a signal that there's also going to be an invitation to EU membership. Now, Ukraine, the economic potential of EU membership would be massive for a country like Ukraine. For comparison, when Poland, another post-Soviet country, entered the EU in the subsequent 10 or 15 years, its economy doubled in size because the potential for for skilled Polish workers to earn a much higher salary in other places in the EU and then remit those salaries back to Poland facilitated tremendous economic growth. And eventually it became not just workers leaving the EU in search of higher wages, it became EU companies in search of skilled labor at a lower rate that would relocate to Poland. So the economic potential of EU membership and NATO membership are tremendous. But the thing that NATO membership offers is the Article 5. And that is a guarantee by all NATO members that if someone tries to violate your sovereignty in a subsequent way, that sovereignty, that will be defended with the equivalent response as though it was an attack on the country themselves, right? So again, if a Russian brigade was to drop into Krakow, Poland, it would be treated by the United States with the equivalent response as though a Russian brigade airdropped into New York City. And that is important in the NATO partnership. It's the source of strength, right? It's not like Kim Jong-un's and Vladimir Putin's no limits partnership, where Kim Jong-un says, yeah, you're in a war, Putin, but I think I can spare 10,000 soldiers for you. Maybe I'll just sell you some artillery shells. NATO's like, nah, dude, like we do those things. We exchange soldiers. We have joint training. We do material. But when the chips are down, when bullets are flying, and you officially make that request, we show up. We show up as hard as you do, right? And so that's important. It's not nothing. And Ukraine wants that because it's a deterrence. It guarantees, as he points out, it sends a message to Putin that his effort to blunt Ukrainian, not so much NATO membership, but NATO membership was part of it, but the larger Ukrainian turn to the West, that has to fail. And Ukrainian NATO membership implies a resolution to the territorial disputes, because you cannot become a NATO member unless you control all of your territory. So it implies that in some way, the territorial disputes must reach a resolution. But it does not say, nowhere in here does he say, that Ukraine needs the restoration of all of its territory. He references the peace plan that does talk about a level of territorial integrity that must be maintained. But I think this is really significant, right? Because this is a guarantee of Ukrainian sovereignty that is much stronger than, remember, the Budapest Agreement, or Budapest? The agreement where Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for guarantees of sovereignty. And that wasn't worth the paper it was printed on when push came to shove. But NATO is. NATO membership would be. And so that's pretty essential for Ukraine to say, our survival is guaranteed as a state. Now then, the second point, he talks about increasing the strength of Ukraine's armed forces, which is important. But he also acknowledges that they're going to defend their positions on the battlefield while ensuring the war is brought to Russia's territory, right? And they have some additional details about some of the things they want. You can pretty much predict what they are, right? Reducing Russian forces' offensive potential, continuing operations in the enemy's territory in order to prevent buffer zones on Ukrainian territory, right? Which is interesting because this acknowledges the existence of the potential for the creation of buffer zones within Ukraine. And I actually think this is an area where Russia and Ukraine might actually not be that far off. Putin may be willing to accept a level of demilitarization, what he is going to call demilitarization. In practice, I think what it'll look like is more like semi-independent occupied regions, something like Transnistria, or even what the Donbas region was considered by Russia prior to 2022, where they said, well, they're sort of an independent republic, they're kind of sort of their own thing, and as Russia, we totally recognize them and we support them to the nth degree. And so that, I think, is an acknowledgement that this sort of thing may persist on some level. Again, a recognition of the reality that Crimea and Donbas have been controlled by the Russians for a decade now. And it's a little bit like possession is 9/10 of the law. They also say they want assistance from their partners in manning reserve brigades, which is, I'm not really sure. The literal interpretation of this would mean that you want your partners to actually send soldiers into those brigades. But I think what they mean are programs like what the Poles have, where Ukrainian citizens living in Poland will have the option to join a reserve brigade, right? There's air defense assistance, expanding Ukrainian drone production, lifting restrictions on long-range weapons, and receiving real-time or near real-time satellite data. They also acknowledge This plan has a secret annex accessible only to the partners. Now, what I think the secret annex is probably some sub points within these sub points, which spell out more closely, hey, here is exactly where we think we're going to try to push Russia back in our territory, and where maybe even an acknowledgement of where Ukraine is most likely to accept a level of buffer zone with Russia. Again, that is something that those diplomatic stances are something that Russia would really want to know when they get to the negotiating table. And so it makes sense that it would be at least they would try to maintain a certain level of secrecy. They may also have specifics simply saying, hey, here's exactly what we want permission to do. Here's the exact depths that we want to get permission to fire. And I think all of those sort of things, Russia just can't, they just don't want to give Russia the specifics of Ukraine's conditions, because it'll tell Russia how to structure its operations. If for example, if Ukraine says, we want the right to fire 200 kilometers into Russian territory, the Russians will know to put all their bases at the 201st kilometer, right? So I think that's not a huge deal. All right, before we talk about the third point, I want to mention that if you feel like you have a little too much, you're deterred by what you have to do, you may not need to invade your neighbor, right? You may just need a little gum. Check out Strike Gum. Listen, I created this inspired by my time in Afghanistan, when if I needed caffeine on a combat patrol, I had to take these military issue energy drinks called Rippets. They're disgusting. They're absolutely awful. And if you've ever had a lukewarm energy drink, it's an awful experience. So I said, listen, there's got to be a way to get an energy drink's worth of caffeine into something portable, something that tastes good, something that's compact and lets you do your job. That's why I created Strike Gum. This bad boy has 90 milligrams of caffeine in each piece, but 0 sugar. So you won't get a sugar crash. You'll just get that nice natural caffeine, right? It literally is natural caffeine, and we derive it from green coffee beans. It's made in the USA. It's veteran owned. Check it out. StrikeGum.com. We're also the highest rated energy gum on Amazon. Thank you guys who have left those 5-star reviews. That makes a huge difference. You have no idea. So if you're interested, check it out at StrikeGum.com or on Amazon. Okay. Now, deterrence. I thought this was really interesting. They said this also has a secret annex. And he specifically says the annex is so secret that only Five Eyes countries seem to have it. US, UK, France, Italy, and Germany. These are countries with highly sophisticated armed forces who can actually maintain state secrets, which says that this state secret is serious. Now, right? The concept is deterrence. And this, I think, is really interesting. And this is what we talked about actually in an earlier video. Because he simply says a non-nuclear type of deterrence. And what I believe Zelensky's saying is to draw clearer boundaries, right? Nuclear deterrence works because both sides have clear boundaries. They're publicly disclosed. They say these are the parameters that would result in us launching our strategic nuclear weapons, right? Now, there's a little strategic ambiguity on the sides. We say, listen, we reserve the right to, like they could be deployed in different circumstances, but the world ender will only be launched if you fire a nuclear weapon at our territory. And because of the NATO treaty, our territory is from Krakow to California, right? So the U.S. says, no, here are the parameters. If you nuke Krakow, if you nuke 1 inch of Polish territory, it will be treated like you detonated a nuke in New York, and we will launch our strategic arsenal at you, at all of your military facilities, all of your states. And Russia says the same thing. If you drop a nuke anywhere, or you launch what we believe to be a nuclear first strike, we will fire everything we have at you. There is no confusion. There is no debate. There is no speculation. There is no maybes. And that is how deterrence works, because it sets clear consequences. Just like parenting, you give the kids clear consequences and clear boundaries about what's right and wrong, they're going to respect them as long as they believe you're credible. And this is what Zelensky's asking for. He says, listen, We don't need to be nuclear deterrence. We need a conventional deterrence. And what I believe is in the annex is exactly what sort of behaviors he wants the West to deter and what kind of tools they might have to do it. So as I discussed, bringing in a third country as a combatant, as Russia has done with North Korea, the West has to say, this is unacceptable. You cannot do these things. And here are the clearly delineated consequences of enforcement. So if we find you have deployed a North Korean unit, we reserve the right to use our air power to destroy that unit and any adjacent units, right? That would be a deterrence to say, if you bring them into our territory, our aircraft will destroy them. You could say something like, you cannot target Ukrainian infrastructure. Everything beyond this line is a no-fly zone, and it will be enforced by the full weight of the U.S. And UK's air defense arsenal. This is what we do for Israel. We do it for Israel. When the Iranians launched all those drones, what did we do? Our ships, our Patriot missile batteries, our fighter jets took to the air and took all those drones out. Barely any penetrated Israeli airspace, because that was what we said. We said, listen, we're not a party in this conflict, but we're setting some ground rules. And one of them is you cannot bomb civilian cities indiscriminately. And Zelenskyy says you need to implement something similar for Ukraine, right? You literally, and here's what I think drives him fucking crazy. And it sort of drives me crazy too. The West, in many ways, protects Russia more than it protects Ukraine. Because think about it. The West has a policy that says, whatever you do, you can't strike Moscow. But they say if the Russians strike Kiev, all fucking bets are off. The West isn't going to do dick about it. And so I think what Zelenskyy says is, listen, you have to put some skin in the game. Probably, I strongly suspect it's something like a no-fly zone, because that's something that we've seen Western countries enforce. Notable is like Bosnia. In the Bosnian Civil War in the 90s, you saw, or the Yugoslav Civil Wars in the 90s, you saw them say, hey, listen, we're going to have a no-fly zone to prevent aircraft from bombing civilian targets because we've seen you do it before, right? So I think that kind of deterrence is absolutely on the table, even if a lot of people in the West may not want it. It doesn't have to be the United States per se. It can be the UK, France, Italy, Germany. They have at least some of the capacities. We know, for example, that the UK can fly the F-35, a stealth fighter, and that can be sufficient, right? You can at least create a certain level of no-fly zone. That's strongly what I think he's talking about. There may also be other consequences that involve something like conventional strikes to say, again, if you're found to be doing X, Y, and Z, these are the consequences. But you have to spell them out explicitly. And that is a tough sell, but I don't think it's crazy, right? Of course, what they talk about at point 4, he talks about Ukraine's economic potential. And I think this is actually a really significant point about the growth of Ukraine's economic potential, because I think this is really focused on the because it's a later point, so it's meant to be kind of after negotiations. The last two sort of are. And the economic strength of Ukraine, as Ukraine has found out, is essential to winning a war. And to someone like President Trump, former President Trump, who may win the election, he is someone who's persuaded quite convincingly if you tell him that there is a net profit to this operation. And I think what Ukraine is saying is like, listen, and he says this economic point actually has another secret annex with certain partners. I think it's the United States. And I think it says, listen, especially if Trump is elected, if you let us win this war, we will offer you a deal of a lifetime to access Ukrainian resources. You could partner with Ukrainian state companies at a discounted rate. We won't tax you if you extract significant natural resources, right? To say, hey, listen, we need this victory so badly that we are willing to pay you, but only after you deliver on your promises. And to someone like Trump, if they said, hey, listen, Ukraine has $1 trillion in lithium under its, out in the East, right? That's because that's what the eastern part of Ukraine is. It's heavily industrialized. They say, listen, there's a lot of natural resources. There are trillions of dollars, and all we need to seize them is to invest 500 or 600 billion. And they go, listen, you'll double your money in 10 years, right? And here's the thing: someone like Trump, that's probably the logic I think he operates on. He's not demonstrated a more sophisticated economic sense than that. But I think there's actual truth to this that says that if you're the EU and you bring in, or you're the US, and you say, listen, we're going to have an exclusive, very favorable trade arrangement with a country like Ukraine, the potential, the economic potential, the growth potential there is absolutely phenomenal. Phenomenal. Because again, you have this nice sweet spot of a highly educated population. Again, it's going to be like Poland. Highly educated population, highly motivated to work, lots of industries. And then you get really favorable trade terms or work terms. Again, something that says, hey, U.S. companies that employ Ukrainians, you don't pay taxes. You don't pay dick for taxes. You paid your taxes when you helped us win the war. You guys don't. A company's going to go, yeah, absolutely, dude. We would hire these dudes in a heartbeat for no taxes. So I think that's the secret annex. Secret annex is the math behind this that says, listen, whatever you spent on it, you're going to make 5 or 6 times that back over the course of the next decade, especially given the growth potential of Ukraine, given just everything that's happened, the relationships between the countries, the potential for EU membership, right? I mean, imagine a country that you're the United States or US manufacturer. Imagine somebody who joins the EU and at the same time has an extremely favorable tax deal with the United States. It would give the U.S. a massive leg up. Any company that invested there would get a massive leg up in accessing the Ukrainian market, or the EU market at large. Huge potential. And that's what I think this point is. And they say, listen, you've got to help us, but we're offering you a lot of help on our end, right? And the fifth point, he says explicitly, is post-war. And he's like, listen, we want to be NATO troops. We want to be actively involved. And what this is a two-sided coin. So he says, listen, as Ukrainians, we're going to help you guys. We want to train your units. We want to show you guys how to fight and win against this Russian force, right? But there's another thing, and that is we will replace certain contingents of U.S. armed forces in Europe with Ukrainian units after the war. This is also part of a very Trumpian mindset, because Trump has said, hey, I want to see, we spend a lot of money stationing our troops overseas. Why don't we have Ukrainian units do it? And he says, listen, we'll save you all that money. We will totally save you all that money. On the upside, the other upside, is that there's another unspoken side of the coin to this. And that is actually reciprocity. And it means that they say, listen, yeah, we'll be happy to have our units stationed in Europe. We want to see some of your units stationed in Ukraine. So that it says that not only are we NATO members, where there's a pinky promise, a contract that says you'll defend us, we want to have your actual people on the ground. Not a lot of them, right? This is what the U.S. did in Germany during the Cold War. We had one of our first armored divisions sat in the Fulda Gap, the geographic feature where the Soviets were most likely to drive their tanks. And they were sat right at the gap, right at the entrance to the Fulda Gap. And the reason was not because they were going to win. They weren't. They were going to get killed. That was why they existed. They were there to put U.S. skin in the game on day one of an invasion. The U.S. would say, listen, whatever else the Soviets do, if they try to take Germany, they're going to have to go through Americans. First things first, on day one. And the Americans were like, we're not going to just let them do it, And that the idea was a demonstration to West Germany at the time that said, this is the strength of our commitment. Our lives are committed to defending your country. And I think that's what Ukraine is obliquely saying. It can't speak for any armed forces but its own, but it says, listen, this is for both of us. We need to make sure this commitment is real. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you to the Colonel tier members: Martin Baum, Chris Rossi, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, Sergey Zinchenko, Chris Holmes, Chris Gorsuch, Daniel M., Ida Skycall, all Lieutenant tier members. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. I appreciate you guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.